Let me address the title now so it's out of the way. Why is it a double negative, aside from legally separating myself from Super Eyepatch Wolf? I changed the title at the last minute, so this joke doesn't work anymore. It used to be called Why You Shouldn't Not Watch the Monogatari series, but let's be honest, it sounds dumb, so here we are. Why else? Well, because a lot of the talk you hear about this show, if you haven't watched it yet, feels largely irrelevant to my experience with this story when I did watch it. So in addition to talking about what this show does well, I also want to address some of the things you might have heard out of the corner of your ear. I believe this show has been done a disservice by some of the conversation that we have about it. Not because any of it is necessarily incorrect, but because the oddness of certain elements out of context, it makes the show sound weirder than it actually is. Specifically, I'm talking about the fanservice, the haremness, the watch order, and the episodicness. So let's start off with those topics and move on to what's great about the show afterwards. Take note of the inherent irony in the fact that I'm going to talk about topics I feel are too frequently discussed, but then ignore that irony and move on because there's no clever twist, I'm just adding to the problem. Lots of discussion out there about watch order, there's videos dedicated to it, reaction channels ask for advice about it, and that's all fine, there should be videos about it, because it's confusing. My mistake was thinking I needed to decide on one before I started watching. Should I do novel release order, or series release order, or chronological, like a psychopath might? If you have a strong opinion on this before starting, go ahead and pick something, but you're gonna find yourself with a lot of words ending in Monogatari thrown at you and very little context attached. My suggestion is as follows. Watch Bake Monogatari, that's the first part regardless of watch order, it's 15 episodes, then decide on the rest when you're done with those. Presumably, if you get through that, you'll have the motivation and investment and understanding to actually figure out what the rest of the order should be. Here's the one I used. The decision to be made after Bake is whether you want the background of the main character and his pet vampire explained, which you get in the Kizu movies. Following the light novel release order, this is what you're supposed to watch next. But if you like the mystery or you have an aversion to watching anime for more than 20 some minutes at a time, you can go straight to Nisei as well. More than one workable option has never been something the internet's handled well. The mega fans of the show want other people to experience the story in the precise way that they know to be the ideal through hindsight. And it's well intentioned and probably correct, but I imagine spreadsheets like this one also make a good amount of people say, you know what? My Hero Season 4 is airing, and that has convenient numbers at the end so I don't have to think about all this. Not because it's necessarily that difficult or complicated, but just because we have so many other options for things to watch, and most of them don't require any decision making beforehand. And as such, my suggested watch order for this show is Bake first, and then think about it later. I'm particularly unqualified to comment on this because I've never seen what you'd call a typical harem show, and yet I would bet the life of my immediate and extended family on the fact that the Monogatari series does not fall into any of the traps you might fear from a show of this genre. Is there a normal-ish high school boy who's fawned over by lots of cute girls? Sure, there are. That's so surface level that it barely seems worth mentioning in hindsight. What I mean by that is not that the girls in their fawning don't play a role in the story, or that it's just a gag. What I do mean is that at no point does it ever feel like this show forces these elements into the story when they don't need to be there. When those elements are there, they're so well built up and so well executed that there's no doubt in your mind that oh, she absolutely would fall for him. If it wasn't for the occasional self-aware reference, the Araragi Harem, I probably wouldn't have even thought of the show in those terms. Only 3 of the girls actually express romantic interest in him, which is still a high number I guess. Love is cheap after all. But the rest of the harem are there in a more or less friendly capacity, which is why Oshino gets to be a member. I say more or less because while a good number of the girls express no romantic interest in Araragi, he or they, or maybe just the writer, has an uncanny ability to just add a little splash of sexy, just a pinch, into any scene that isn't dealing with something too serious for it. And we'll get to the whys later, but that probably adds to the view of this show as a harem, since accidental sexualization sort of comes with that territory. And that's probably what the show is most famous for, at least among people who haven't seen it. As I said, I'm not an expert on the genre, and honestly I don't mind counting this as a harem show at all, but if it's a harem, then it's in the same way that Hunter x Hunter is a shonen. No, it has all the features we're looking for in a shonen or harem, but a great deal of care has been put into distinguishing it from its peers in a way that clearly and deliberately subverts the genre. While we're on the topic, if you look it up, Wikipedia tells us that Monogatari is in the fantasy and paranormal genres, which I guess is an equally vacuous statement when it comes to conveying the contents of the series. The lesson to be learned here is this: some works fit poorly into conventional genre boxes. Good question, glad you asked. I had this expectation going in that Monogatari was essentially about the main character meeting a new girl each mini-arc and in some way fixing their problem, then moving on to the next. And that's not too far off the truth, that's very much what the beginning of the show feels like. But what relief I felt in my small bones when I worked out that it's only the method by which characters are introduced to the story. The seasonal names, the arc names and openings probably don't help the perception that this show is a series of vignettes without much to connect them to one another, but thankfully it is merely bait, and a lot of effort put into openings. I'm sure some people wouldn't have minded if it stuck to the oddity of the week formula, because the individual stories are handled very well, but one of the best features of the show is its ability to tie everything, all those more or less unconnected stories, back to an overarching plot or theme, as well as its central cast of characters. An example that springs to mind is the way Kaiki is introduced 18 or so episodes into the show. He could easily feel out of place, or like the infamous plot coincidentally arriving as our heroes run out of the previous plot. But instead, when Kaiki shows up, he already has ties to Karen, to Senjukahara, to Kanbaru, and to Oshino that our main character just doesn't know about yet. And because he has these connections, he doesn't seem like just a new character who's been thrown in to keep the story going. And in general, something this show does extremely well is keeping all of the characters relevant and developing throughout the story, even after their initial personal arcs have concluded. At the point where a lesser show would have considered them developed after their turn in the spotlight and moved on to someone different, Monogatari respects its characters to a refreshing degree. No one has just one problem, no one's problems are fixed from one day to the other. We're always tracking each character's personal progress even when they're not the immediate focus of the story, based on how they interact with the rest of the cast. We get to watch them struggle with the conclusions of their own arcs while they're in the background before they almost seamlessly weave back into the main plot and the center of the story. In terms of structure more specifically, as I've mentioned, Bakemonogatari starts off fairly episodically, with small arcs of 2 to 3 episodes each, and seemingly quite few things tying them to one another. But as the show moves along, the arcs first get longer, then they start incorporating characters we already know, and this is where it starts feeling quite so episodic, since it's building on established characters as its focus. Then when you get deeper still, the arcs start flowing together more smoothly in the sense that each one is not strictly about 1 or 2 characters, but are there mostly for the overarching plot rather than the characters that the arc is named after. That doesn't have to be good or bad, but I think the real question regarding the episodic nature of the show is, when you've seen the first couple of arcs of Monogatari, is the rest of the show just more of the same? Have you experienced what it has to offer? And the answer to that is no you haven't. Not one of the characters introduced in Bake has their story concluded or their purpose fulfilled by the end of Bake. They're like One Piece character introductions in this way. Not much like One Piece characters in any other sense, but you wouldn't dream of saying that the only point where Nami has relevance to One Piece is in Arlong Park. Bakemonogatari is the East Blue saga of the Monogatari series. We're picking up characters now to use them for the plot later on. If you know anything at all about Monogatari, it's likely the fact that there's some fanservice in there on occasion. I've never been someone who gets anything out of fanservice myself, so if that's a turn-off for you from watching the series, then I understand that completely. What I will say is that it's built into the story much more convincingly than in most other cases I've come across. That's not immediately obvious since the show starts off on this scene, and you probably auto scoff at it on first viewing, but it's actually quite apparent that it's Araragi's POV we're following. He's counting the milliseconds that he gets to stare at Hanekawa's panties because he's interested, regardless of whether we're interested or not. And that's part of a broader sense that the show's told from the perspective of Araragi. The most obvious hint is the black scenes indicating his blinking, which puts us right behind his eyes, but it's not just used for fan service. There's a sense of expressionism that pervades the entire show, meaning everything we see is colored through the lens of mainly Araragi's perspective. Not only does that explain his fixation on sex, he's self-admittedly sexually frustrated, but it also explains a lot of the other stylistic choices of the show, like why there's never anyone around who's not relevant to the story. There wouldn't be if it's being told by him. He wouldn't describe people who have no role in the plot. On top of that, we have the exaggerated fight scenes. This one's debatable, I think, but there's some circumstances in which normal humans do some quite outrageous things, like Karen smashing this thing, which can be interpreted as Araragi exaggerating the fights, either for dramatic effect or just to get across how strong she is compared to him, how it feels to be fighting her. Or it could just be that that's possible in the Monogatari universe, so that they can do a shonen gag with Karen on occasion. This perspective-conscious style of storytelling extends beyond the boundaries of Araragi as well. In the sections where he's not the main character, most of the stylistic choices are maintained, but slight variations do rear their heads when he's not looking. We get to see characters who we don't usually meet in Araragi's story. most notably Mrs. Araragi, who shows up in Nekoshiro, having been previously omitted from the story by her son. She's not blending into the background for Hanekawa because she says something with significance to her story. The reason background characters are omitted from Araragi's story is supposedly that they aren't important, but is it really possible that his mom isn't important to his story, but she is important to Hanekawa's? Seems there are deeper reasons at play. Adding to that, a comment I saw somewhere pointed out that Araragi shows up in the other characters' POV stories like that character thinks of him. For Hanekawa, he's the hero showing up at the last second, defeating the enemy and rescuing her. For Kenbaru, he's a senpai, she looks up to him as a role model, so he's the responsible adult to her childish antics. And to Kaiki, he's fucking annoying. He goes around ruining everything, and if he shows up at the end of Hitagi-en, that's what he would do. Exactly like he intends when he does show up. I've moved away from the topic of fanservice somewhat, I realize, and really that's because I don't care about it. I don't normally like fanservice. I think fanservice scenes more often than not are just wasting time that could be spent on characters or plot. So take it for the massive compliment it is when I say that it didn't bother me at all in this show. I find it never intrudes on the story, it never breaks the pacing, and it never feels unnatural for the characters or the style. In short, it's so exceptionally well built into the world of the show that it feels unnatural to talk about it in a separated segment. There's nothing to say about the fan service if you can't talk about the perspective character and his worldview. And in that sense, this too is one of those elements of the story that you'll have heard about before you watch the show, yet it's impossible to probably have a conversation about it until after you've watched it. The gist of it is, if the fan service is what's stopping you from watching the show, then you better get used to seeing some anime panties, boy, cause that's a bad excuse, and I will hunt you down for it. What I'm trying to say with all this is that this show is so much more than what you've heard about it in passing, and that sounds obvious perhaps, but it's not really. What have you heard about One Piece before reading it? Well, it's a pirate adventure, there's a crew, there's a treasure, there's some adventuring. That's pretty much what you're getting. Hunter x Hunter, I might have had the wrong assumptions going in when I watched it, but the basics are still widely known. It's a strong power system, it's subversive, it's darker than it appears on the surface, and it's very good. That's pretty accurate to what the show is, but in the case of Monogatari, I felt like I knew vaguely what I was in for when I started, except it just turned out I was entirely wrong. Not that the elements that we've talked about here didn't exist, but as I think I've explained, they take up way less space in the show and way less space in the mind of someone watching the show than they do in the conversation about the show. Which is why that's it for the bad excuses section. We're moving on to the much more interesting topic of what the show does well, or as I'll claim, what the show does better than any other show that exists. The dialogue is the most obvious example of something the show does well. Much of the early episodes are spent listening to one girl or another banter with her main character, and while it took me a minute to really get into it, more specifically it took until episode 3, since you have to get used to the characters, the pacing, the flashing texts, all the stylistic weirdness that comes with the territory. Once you've learned the language that it's attempting to teach you, it's truly some of the snappiest, sweetest, wittiest dialogue I've ever seen anywhere. Characters manage to go on odd, hilarious tangents about things that should have no relevance to them or the story, yet it usually manages to say something crucial about themselves or someone else, or it thematically ties into the plot and does it all in a way that's opaque and intriguing when you first start the arc, yet perfectly coherent and appropriate once the arc is finished. In most cases anyway. One of the things I feel like I'm always struggling to find in media is a middle ground between something with literary value with some poetry to it, and something that does what we know works in terms of how to write compelling characters, how to get you emotionally invested, and how to have an interesting plot. Unfortunately, while following a tested formula makes you good at the latter, it often comes at the expense of the uniqueness required to qualify as the former. Since the formulas we know work every time, while something like Evangelion might have some interesting things to say, it was a struggle for me to watch it because I either didn't really care about the characters or in some cases actively disliked them. And you don't need to like the characters for Eva to be good, but sometimes it'd be nice to have a show which is both smart and engaging. And this is really what I feel Monogatari does better than any other show out there. I don't know if it's the dialogue or the heartfelt character moments, or if it's anything specific at all, but it's so rare to find a show which will have genuinely original, interesting things to say about philosophy and psychology and love and life, while at the same time making you really care about the characters and the story on a personal, emotional level. There's an almost perfect balance here of drama and poetry, and it's something I feel like I'm always looking for, and now that I've seen Monogatari, I can't come up with another example of it being done. Not with the degree of care and precision that you find in these stories. Adding to that some of the sharpest dialogue ever put to paper in a style which is wholly its own, frankly it depresses me to no end that opinions about the show are in any way split. I'm not sure exactly how split they are, but my general feeling is that it's one of those shows with a some people love it, some people hate it reputation going on, and I don't know what to say to the people who hate it, except why? How? Do you hate originality? Do you only like watching Dragon Ball on repeat? Do you feel human emotions? I will beat you. I will beat you to within an inch of your life.
But at least Seinfeld had a layer of humor to that nothingness.
I realize for some people, things being too different from the norm is a turn off rather than the opposite, and Monogatari does have some rank 5 weeb moments. There's some Japan in there to get used to, is what I'm saying, and I think the cultural divide stands out more in Monogatari than it does in most other shows. Most obviously Japan's siscon and lolicon culture, which feels more acceptable somehow when they don't call it incest and pedophilia like we do, but that is what it is, and it's there to be funny, and some people aren't gonna find that funny. Fair enough. Hard to argue for it, really. I do find it funny, in a slightly uncomfortable way most of the time. I can't watch The Office though, I find that uncomfortable. There you go. Different folk, different taste and humor. Having addressed that, I think there's more to the cultural divide here than what stands out at first. Western media, even Western fantasy stories, tend to strive to be as realistic as possible. Game of Thrones is the obvious example, but even if you dive into current high fantasy trends along the lines of Brandon Sanderson, it's more or less all supposed to be believable within its own context, and a great deal of effort spread over a great deal of pages goes into convincing you of the logic of the story. Whereas this show especially, but also Japanese media as a whole, is more concerned with making things connect in a way that makes sense for the characters, the themes, the symbolism, rather than any sense of logic or realism. Now I know for a fact that some people are annoyed by symbolism in general, and while I'm annoyed by those people, I'm gonna try not to talk down to them. I think the reason those people are annoyed is the fact that you can't be sure whether symbolism is intentional or it's overinterpretation. And that's a difficult problem. With overinterpretation you can make anything in the world seem really deep. However, in the particular case of the Monogatari series, I'd argue there's no question that almost anything you can think of regarding the personalities and their stories, the writer Nishio is aware of it. If nothing else, because the characters themselves tend to analyze every aspect of the story as much as the reader does. And while there's often room to go deeper than Araragi does, all the stories essentially end up confirming that the whole show is about personality analysis. You never feel like you're over-analyzing regardless of whether your thoughts turn out to be right or wrong, when the entire show is about that idea. Now, having finished the show, which I hadn't while writing most of this, I return for the epilogue, or the punchline if you will. I often find myself, when I finish consuming a story that really resonated, I find myself compelled to say something smart and interesting about it to make other people understand why it's so good. And yet anything I could say about the Monogatari series, any overarching analysis of it, pales in comparison to the analysis the show does of itself. It's a show entirely made up of character analysis, so how can I hope to express anything that the show doesn't itself express over the course of 100 episodes? I can't, so I won't. All I'll say is that the consistency with which this show manages to be profound yet hilarious, confusing yet logical, inconsistent and varied yet truer to itself than almost anything else I've seen, is nothing short of fucking miraculous. Nishio is a genius in the truest sense of the word. The sense that this is a story which in almost any other hand would have fallen apart 100 times along the way. It's too ambitious and complicated for it to make sense, and yet it makes complete and total sense. Not a thread is left hanging. It feels like it was all planned exactly like this from the start, and this is both the way each arc makes you feel, initial confusion followed by a deeper understanding, as well as how the show in its entirety makes you feel. I'm sad that it's over because I know I'll never find anything else like it. I'm jealous that it's so well constructed that I can't possibly hope to write anything that compares, and most of all I can't wait to start reading the novels. Thank you for listening to my rant.